Hi everyone, my name's Noah and today I'm going to be talking to you about the overlap between geography, human geography, landscape and art. Just to briefly introduce myself first, I grew up in Cumbria and I moved to Oxford to study geography for my undergraduate degree. I then worked in clinical trials with older people with hip fractures for 2 years, and I'm now about to start a PhD in Edinburgh looking at care transitions in remote communities. During my undergraduate, I became particularly interested in social and cultural geography, and my dissertation focused on fell running, the concept of landscape, and the technologies that fell runners employ, ranging from basic technologies like shoes to things like GPS watches and the mobile application Strava. And also, just to provide a brief summary of this video, in it I'll focus on the cultural geography side of things, particularly on the concept of landscape, and in the first half I'll provide something of a history of engagement by geographers with landscape. Then towards the second half I'll talk about how art might tie into this. I've tried not to overcomplicate things and to keep it fairly succinct. Obviously different people like different things when it comes to presentations, but personally I like presentations that give you a basic grounding that you can use as a basis for further understanding, and that's what I've tried to do here. So I guess the key first question to ask is, how do we define landscape? And if you do a quick Google search, one of the first things that comes up is the dictionary.com definition that defines landscape as a section or expanse of rural scenery, usually extensive, that could be seen from a single viewpoint. And there's two things I just want to pick out in this common sense definition. Firstly, I don't want to pick out that landscape here is defined as a material thing as opposed to just an idea. And secondly, I want to pick out that landscape is seen as a visual thing as opposed to something that's apprehended through other senses such as sound or touch. And these themes of what actually is landscape and how exactly do we encounter it come up throughout this presentation. Continuing with the theme of what landscape actually is, we can look at Carl Sauer and the Berkeley or Berkeley if you're American school that was based at the University of California in the US in the 1920s. And this school was critical of an approach that was dominant in geography at the time that was known as environmental determinism. And in short, that was the idea that the landscape determines culture. And this was seen as problematic because it was used to justify racist attitudes. So instead of viewing landscape as determining culture or society, Sauer and the Berkeley School viewed it as a raw medium for transformation by humans. So as Sauer himself put it, the cultural landscape is fashioned from a natural landscape by a cultural group. Culture is the agent, the natural area is the medium, the cultural landscape is the result. And the task here for geographers was a detailed analysis of the material landscape, which involved gathering facts about how we change landscapes over time. So in the context of the Fellfoot Forward project, we might think of agricultural buildings and dry stone walls as changes imposed by humans upon the material landscape. Moving on, we can now look at Marxist approaches to landscape, which were developed in the 1970s and the 1980s onwards, and these provided the first real challenge to the Berkeley School dominance of cultural geography for over 50 years. So while Marxist thinking traditionally viewed economic conditions as determining culture, Marxist geographers such as Stephen Daniels, Dennis Cosgrove, and more recently Don Mitchell drew on theorists who saw culture as its own arena of change and conflict. So in short, they gave the cultural more importance. And the Marxist geographers reconceptualized nature not as a raw medium for human transformation, like Sauer and the Berkeley School would have done, but as a social and cultural production itself. So here within Marxist geography, we see two related senses of landscape emerging, both as a material thing in the world and as an ideological construct. And crucially, both are seen to serve the powerful. So we can think of the ownership of large swathes of land in the material sense by individuals or by families who have the ability to control what happens on that land. And we can also think of the very idea of landscape, which emerged alongside the emergence of merchant capitalists in places such as Venice and Flanders from the 14th century onwards. And art was key to this development of landscape as an idea. So the use of linear perspective during the Renaissance era made it possible to depict landscapes from the point of view of the observer, usually the owner. And indeed, many landowners commissioned landscape paintings which hung in their houses and represented their control over their land. And I think both senses of landscape here can be applied to Fellfoot Forward. So we might think of the work that goes into the creation of the material, natural landscape of the fells, such as sheep grazing, or the ways it can and can't be used as a result of it being an area of outstanding natural beauty. And we can also think of it as a cultural construct with different meanings for different people, whether those be locals or tourists or others. So following on from Marxist geography, a new approach was developed within cultural geography that became known as the New Cultural Geography. And this approach continued the shift from Marxism to the cultural sphere through adding in other theoretical approaches, so things like feminism, postmodernism, post-structuralism, and also by looking beyond class conflict to areas such as gender and race. And the New Cultural Geography developed the metaphor of landscape as a text, as something that represents the meanings of the powerful. And that the way this analysis was often done was through interpretation of literal texts and paintings. So new cultural geographers would take a text or a painting and look at the meanings contained within it. For instance, Gillian Rose, a well-known feminist geographer, in her classic Feminism and Geography, which was published in 1993, looks at Thomas Gainsborough's celebrated mid-18th century landscape painting, Mr. and Mrs. Andrews. So we can see the painting here on screen now. And what Rose pointed out was that in contrast to art historians who conventionally describe the two figures as the owners of the land, Rose focuses on how Mrs. Andrews is actually depicted as part of the land and thus the property of Mr. Andrews. And it's clear here that in the New Cultural Geography, the emphasis is on landscape as a cultural construct rather than as a material presence. So the final approach to landscape I'm going to discuss is known as non-representational theory, and this approach was developed initially by a geographer known as Nigel Thrift. And non-representational theory is critical of the focus on landscape as text or as representation when this comes to the detriment of other ways of engaging with landscapes, particularly through practices. It's important to point out that this isn't to say that representations of landscapes aren't important, but what is being said is that our interaction with the world can't be reduced to text alone. And non-representational theory thus reintroduces a material, albeit a shifting materiality, aspect of the landscape to the picture. So for instance, John Wiley, in a paper published in 2005, discusses a day he spent walking on the southwest coast path in North Devon, and he highlights how the practice of walking and the multiple sensations it brings with it are formative of the experience of landscape. And similarly, in my dissertation, I considered fell runners and their interaction with the landscape. So building on the literatures already discussed, I argued for an understanding of landscape as a multisensory, embodied and technologically mediated experience that's not only apprehended visually and that's not natural. So to illustrate this, I looked at some of the terms used to describe landscape. So things like tussock, trod and line, which are all indicative of movement through the land. I looked at some of the differences in the experience of landscapes across different genders and ages. And I looked at the use of technologies by fell runners, including things like shoes and Strava. In turn, this has practical implications. So for instance, it allows us to question landscape designations and the activities that we allow to take place in certain landscapes. So far I've been through three approaches to landscape by geographers. I started off by looking at Carl Sauer and the Berkeley School's more descriptive approach. I then moved on to look at Marxist approaches which focused on the landscape and power, and which later morphed into the New Cultural Geography, which developed the metaphor of landscape as text. And most recently I've looked at non-representational theory, which considered landscape as practiced and experienced. So how does art tie into all of this? Well, as I've already discussed, art, specifically landscape paintings, has been integral to the development of the idea of landscape itself. But what I want to look at by way of a conclusion is how the more recent approaches that I've just talked about relate to more recent art. So if we think of landscape as something that's continually unfolding as we experience it, rather than as something material that we simply described or as a fixed text, then art takes on new significance. And art becomes a means of evoking our more than visual two-way interaction with an ever-changing landscape, and in turn that has some political and ethical implications. So that there's quite a lot of directions in which this could be taken, but drawing on a geographer called Harriet Hawkins, who writes quite a lot about the relationship between geography and art, I'm going to draw out just two of these. So firstly, I want to say that art makes possible different understandings of power and of vision in the landscape, and art offers a means of evoking a more than visual engagement with the landscape. So we might think of the sound and the feel of the wind on the fells. And in turn, I think by doing this, art might offer a route to encouraging people that don't traditionally venture out into landscapes like the North Pennines to get out there and to enjoy them. Then second, I think there's the possibility that art might contribute to the development of an environmental consciousness. So art that emphasises our interaction with the landscape might prompt us to think more closely about both the impact the landscape has on us and the impact we have on the landscape. So for instance, it might focus on developing a public that's more informed when it comes to topics like hill farming, biodiversity and flooding. Here are some of the references that I've used to make this presentation. They're largely behind paywalls, which tend to be quite expensive to access, but for some of them it's possible to request the paper from the author on researchgate.net. So I know Hawkins' paper is on there, for instance, and I'm sure if you're an artist and you requested that paper, that she'd be happy to give it to you. There's also Tim Cresswell's book on here, which is fairly cheap and is a very good introduction to geography, but it doesn't have very much on art. Hopefully this presentation has been informative and you've enjoyed it, and thanks very much for listening. And also feel free to email me at the email address below, noahhurton@gmail.com, and I'll get back to you if you have any questions.